The wind in eastern Colorado had a cruel mind of its own in 1881. It scraped across the high plains like a blade, stealing hope from anyone who tried to stand against it. Dust ruled the town of Purgatory Springs. It clung to faces, filled mouths, and settled into every crack of the wooden storefronts. It was the only thing that ever won here. Clara Beaumont felt that wind claw at her hair as she stood on the tall, splintered platform in the town square. Her hands were tied in front of her, the rope rough against her skin. A fading bruise lived on her cheekbone. It still stung when the cold wind touched it. She didn't care. Pain meant nothing now. Her father was dead, and she was being sold like cattle to pay a debt he never owed. Men gathered below the platform, farmers with empty pockets, miners smelling of sulfur, drunken cowboys laughing too loud. They stared at her like she was a thing, not a person. Sheriff Hayes stood beside her, reading out her value as if he were selling a horse. Miss Clara Beaumont, 22 years, healthy, proper raised. He called out, "Bidding starts at $20. The crowd laughed. Some of them shouted things that made her stomach twist. She stared straight ahead, fixing her eyes on the dry goods store across the square. She would not cry. She would turn herself into stone if she had to. Elias Finch watched from the shade of the saloon porch, owner of half the town and the man who had forged the papers that claimed her father owed him money. He planned everything. He wanted her broken before he married her. He wanted her humiliated, and today the whole town helped him do it. The bidding stalled at $30. No one else had the money or the interest. Then a sound cut through the wind. A slow, limping step. A man stepped out from an alley and into the harsh sunlight. The crowd shifted. Some people whispered his name like he was an omen. Thomas Greaves. He was a rancher from the Flat Rock Prairie, a quiet man known more for his scars than anything he ever said. Half his face was shaped by old fire, the skin pale and tight, pulling his mouth into a hard line. His left eye drooped from the burn. His limp was deep, painful looking. He looked older than his years, carved by life and loss. But when he looked up at Clara, he didn't look at her body like the others. He looked at her face, really looked, as if searching for the person still trapped under the dust and shame. Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat nervously. "Evenin', Mr. Greaves. You here to bid?" Thomas didn't answer. He reached into his coat. The whole crowd went silent, waiting for a handful of bills or coins. He pulled out one single silver coin, $1. He flipped it once, caught it, and said in a low, gravelly voice, $1. Laughter exploded across the square. Men bent over holding their sides, pointing at Clara like she was the world's cheapest joke. Even Hayes looked stunned. $1, Greaves!" Hayes barked. "You insult." "That's my bid," Thomas said, steady and calm. Elias Finch's smile stretched wide. This was better for him. This humiliation was deeper. He gave Hayes a small nod. Hayes slammed his hand down. "Sold for $1." The final cheer was crueler than any slap Clara had ever taken. Her stone-hard heart cracked. A hot tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. She leaned forward just enough for her whisper to reach him. "Please, do it quick." If this scarred stranger meant to drag her off and use her, she wanted it over. She had no strength left to fight. But Thomas Greaves didn't climb the platform. He didn't touch her. He didn't even look at the men laughing around them. He tossed the silver coin at Hayes's feet, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a black iron key. He held it up to her. For a heartbeat, she didn't understand. Then he stepped close enough to lay the key on the edge of the platform, near her tied hands. "The spare cabin," he said, voice low. "It locks from the inside." He didn't wait for her to take it. He turned and walked away through the crowd. No fear, no rush. Just a man who didn't belong anywhere near a town full of cruelty. The crowd parted for him without a word. Clara stared at the key. It was real. Heavy. A door she could lock from the inside. Her heart twisted with confusion. Hayes grunted and cut the rope binding her wrists. "Get off my platform. You heard him." Clara stepped down on shaking legs. She didn't look at Finch. She didn't look at the laughing men. She kept her eyes on the key. A small wagon rattled up beside her. An older woman with dark skin and hair wrapped in gray cloth held the reins. "Name's Ruthie," she said gently. "I work for Mr. Greaves. Come on, child, get in." Clara climbed in silently. The wagon rolled away from Purgatory Springs, leaving the town, Finch, and the laughter behind in the dust. Hours later, the tiny ranch came into view. Just a worn house, a leaning barn, and a small spare cabin near a few thin cottonwoods. Ruthie helped her down. "You're safe in that cabin," she said. "He sleeps in the barn." "Always has." Clara walked to the cabin, unlocked the door with trembling fingers, stepped inside, and locked it behind her. The heavy click of the bolt echoed through the empty room. For the first time in months, she was behind a door no man could open, but she didn't feel free. She felt trapped between two terrors, the monster behind her in town, and the quiet, unreadable man who had bought her with a single silver dollar. What if the man you feared most was the only one fighting to save you? The first night in the spare cabin was the longest of Clara's life. The rain hammered the roof, thunder shook the walls, and the wind outside screamed like the wolves that hunted the plains. She had locked the door. She had the key. She had the choice. But fear had a long memory. She sat on the floor, curled against the wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Every crack of thunder made her flinch. Every howl of wind reminded her of the cold night she'd tried to run, only to hear wolves singing in the dark. She held the iron key so tightly, it cut lines into her palm. She wasn't free. Not yet. Freedom required something she didn't have. Trust. Trust in herself. Trust in the scarred rancher who had bought her for $1 and walked away. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was a high blue bowl of cold light. Clara stepped outside and saw Ruthie scattering grain for the chickens. The older woman nodded in her direction, not unkind. "You want something to do?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said quickly. "Anything." Ruthie didn't waste words. "Woodpile's low, well needs pumping. Chickens need feedin'." Clara worked until her hands blistered. She chopped wood, pumped water, mended old shirts, swept the cabin, and gathered eggs. The work hurt, but it was real. Honest pain washed some of the ugliness off her spirit. But the ranch wasn't as empty as it looked. Thomas Greaves moved through it like a quiet shadow. She saw him by the corral fixing a broken post. She saw him in the barn brushing the horses. She saw him limping across the yard, his left side dragging like a weight chained to him. Yet every time she walked close, he moved away. Not out of anger, not out of disgust, out of fear, not of her, of himself. He never came within 20 feet of where she stood. He never looked her full in the face. He vanished when she approached. But she watched his hands, how gentle they were with an injured horse, how careful when he cleaned a wound on a calf, how patient when he walked the perimeter of his land, touching each fence rail like he was checking the bones of a living creature. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a hurt one. It took 3 days for Clara to break. She found him by the corral, swinging a heavy sledgehammer, driving a new post into the ground. Sweat darkened his faded blue shirt. His breath came tight. His limp was worse that morning. She walked straight toward him. "Mr. Greaves," she said. He paused but didn't turn. "I need to ask you something." "Nothing." "Why?" Her voice trembled. "Why did you buy me? Why give me the key? Why keep your distance? Why bring me here at all?" He kept his eyes on the post. The hammer rested in his scarred hand. For a long time, she thought he would stay silent. Then, in a low, rough voice, he said, "It was to stop it." She blinked. "Stop what?" His jaw tightened. "What they were going to do to you." That was all he said. He lifted the hammer and slammed it down, ending the conversation. But inside Clara, something shifted. That one sentence told her everything she needed to know. That night, Ruthie sent her into the main house cellar for a jar of peaches. On her way out, Clara noticed the photograph on the mantel. A young man in a Union uniform. A smiling woman beside him. Both faces bright with hope. The top corner of the photograph was melted and blackened by fire. "That was Samuel," Ruthie said from the kitchen doorway. And his wife, Helen. Clara turned. "Tell me." Ruthie did. She told Clara about the deserters who raided homesteads, about the house they burned, about Samuel fighting to save his wife, about Thomas arriving too late, about him running into the flames, about the beam that fell, about the scars that stayed, about the guilt that never left. "He thinks he failed them," Ruthie murmured. "He thinks he should have died with them." Clara stared at the burnt photograph, her breath caught in her throat. Thomas had lost his brother, his sister-in-law, his home, his voice, half his face, his faith in himself. No wonder he slept in the barn. No wonder he avoided fire. No wonder he kept everyone away. He wasn't just scarred. He was carrying something too heavy for one man to bear. The next day, Clara told Ruthie her own story about her father's death, the forged debts, the lies, the murder. She didn't know Thomas had returned early. She didn't hear him standing in the dark of the barn doorway, listening. When she finished, her tears hot on her cheeks, she saw him. His face pale, his scars stark, his eyes hollow. He heard everything. He disappeared into the barn without a word. Clara felt like her own heart had been scraped raw. She had exposed herself. She had given him more weight to carry. She had hurt him without meaning to. That night, when she returned to her cabin, something lay on the porch. A heavy Navy Colt revolver and a leather pouch filled with coins, more money than she had ever seen. Thomas stood by the barn, just a shadow. "You can run or stay," he rasped. "Your choice." He went inside, the barn door shut behind him. Clara stared at the gun in her hand, at the money in the pouch. He hadn't bought her. He had freed her. But freedom was cold comfort on a prairie full of wolves. So she sat all night by her window, thinking of her father, of Samuel, of Helen, of Thomas running into fire trying to save people he loved. When dawn came, she made her choice. She set the pouch of coins on her porch. She left the gun inside. She picked up the 2 empty water buckets and walked past the barn like she had always belonged on this ranch. Thomas did not look at her, but she knew he'd seen. 2 days later, he handed her the Colt revolver. "You stay," he said simply. "You learn to use it." He taught her how to shoot in a dry arroyo far from the house. Her hands shook. She missed every shot at first. The recoil nearly knocked her over. "Again," he said. She hit the can on her 7th try. He nodded once. Then he taught her to saddle a horse, to ride astride, to rope stubborn cattle, to mend fences, to read the sky. He did not talk much, but he stayed close now, near enough that she felt his presence like a warm shadow. He was not breaking her, he was building her, piece by piece. And piece by piece, she began to see the man underneath the scars. A man who still carried fire inside him, but had never once let it touch her. What if the only man who ever protected you now needed you to save him? The change between Clara and Thomas didn't happen loudly. It wasn't fast. It was careful, like 2 people rebuilding a house after a fire. They worked beside each other. They spoke in small words. They learned each other's habits. Clara fed the chickens and hauled water. Thomas taught her how to ride, how to rope, how to stand tall behind a gun. Every week, a little more of the silence between them broke. But the past has a way of riding back into a man's life. And Elias Finch was not done. One cold morning, 2 riders came into the yard. They weren't locals. They were hired men, with tied-down guns and dark looks in their eyes. Clara froze by the laundry line, a clothespin in her hand. One rider grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Well, Bart," he said, "looks like Mr. Finch's property is doing chores." Clara's stomach twisted. Thomas walked out of the barn, limping but steady. He held a pitchfork, not a gun. The 2 men dismounted, one big and thick-necked, the other thin and cruel-looking. "Finch wants the girl back," the thin one said. "That dollar might have fooled the town, but not him. She owes him, by law." "No," Thomas said quietly. "She stays." Bart, the bigger man, took a step toward Clara. "She ain't yours, Greaves." Thomas lifted the pitchfork. The men snorted. They thought he was weak. They thought the limp meant he couldn't fight. They were wrong. Bart lunged. Thomas moved fast, faster than anyone expected. He spun the pitchfork, cracking it down on Bart's wrist. A sick snap filled the yard. Bart screamed and fell to the ground. The second man yanked his gun. Thomas tackled him before the barrel even lifted. They crashed into the dirt. The gun went off harmlessly. Clara screamed his name. Bart, cradling his broken wrist, pulled a knife and charged. "Thomas! Behind you!" Clara shouted. Thomas turned. The knife slashed deep into the dead, scarred flesh of his left arm. He barely flinched. He grabbed Bart's hand, squeezed until bones crunched, then struck him in the throat. Both men fell, gasping and choking. Thomas could have finished them, could have killed them, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Stop, please, you are not like them." Her voice broke through whatever fire had taken him. He froze, shaking with leftover rage. He dropped the shovel he had lifted over Bart's head. He let them live. "Get up," he rasped at the thin man. "Take him to Finch. Tell him this land is mine. Tell him the girl is not his. Tell him I know what he did to her father." The men scrambled onto their horses and fled. Clara reached for Thomas, tears burning her eyes. "You are hurt," she whispered. He recoiled from her touch, fear, not anger, then walked to the water trough and plunged his wounded arm in. She wanted to follow, but she didn't. She gave him space. That night, the storm rolled in. The thunder shook the house. Rain beat down like fists. Thomas came inside, pale, sweating, barely standing. The cut on his arm had worsened. The old fire scars beneath it were angry and infected. "You're burning up," Clara said. "I'm fine," he rasped, then stumbled into a chair. He wasn't fine. Fever took him fast. He shook. He muttered things she didn't understand. He flinched from the fire in the stove. Ruthie helped her drag him into the bedroom. For 2 nights, he fought ghosts. "Samuel," he whispered. "Helen, take my hand. The roof." His voice was broken. His mind was trapped in flames he never escaped. Clara wiped his forehead with a cool cloth, her tears falling silently. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're safe." The fire is gone. On the 3rd morning his eyes opened, clear, awake, alive, and full of shame. "You should not have brought me in here," he whispered. "You would have died," she said. He closed his eyes. "You heard me talk." "Yes," Clara said gently, "and I'm not leaving." His breath trembled. "Thomas," she whispered, "who was Helen?" He stared at the ceiling. For a long time he didn't answer. Then he told her the truth. All of it. About the deserters. About Samuel shouting for help. About Helen reaching for him through the window. About the beam that fell. About the fire that stole her from his hands. About the guilt that lived in his bones. When he was done, he looked like a man waiting for a sentence. Clara climbed onto the bed lying beside him. He tensed at first, the instinct of a man who feared hurting anything he touched. "Thomas," she whispered, her face inches from his, "you did not fail them." Her voice shook. "You saved me." For the first time in years, something broke inside him that was not pain. It was hope. He lifted his hand, his good hand, and touched her cheek. Slowly, carefully, as if she might shatter. "Clara," he whispered. She didn't move away. He kissed her. Soft, trembling. Like a question, she answered by pulling him close. That night, 2 broken souls held each other like shelter from the storm. The peace didn't last. A week later, while Clara fed the chickens and Thomas mended a corral rail, riders appeared again. Many more this time. Sheriff Hayes, deputies, and Elias Finch himself. Finch's smile was cold. "Thomas Graves," he called, "you are under arrest for kidnapping and theft of property." "Clara is not your property," Thomas said. Finch laughed. "She was sold, signed over, and you stole her." Hayes unrolled a fake document. Wardship contract. Her father gave her to Finch before he passed. "That's a lie," Clara shouted, but Hayes only smirked. Women sold for debt don't get to speak. Two deputies grabbed Thomas. He fought, swinging a fence rail like a club, but he was weak from illness. They struck him down, beating him until he could barely breathe. Clara tried to reach him, but Finch grabbed her, pinning her arms. "You see?" Finch hissed. "You belong to me." Ruthie suddenly grabbed Clara's wrist. "Child, you can't fight this, but you can finish it." "What do I do?" Clara gasped. "Ride," Ruthie whispered fiercely. "Ride now." Clara ran. She mounted Dust, the mare Thomas had taught her to love. She kicked hard and vanished across the prairie. Finch laughed behind her. "Let her go. She'll crawl back." He had no idea who Clara Beaumont had become. She rode all night, wolves howling at her heels, fear snapping at her bones, but she kept going. She carried the tin box with Thomas's papers. His truth, his service records, his discharge. She reached Covenant Creek at dawn, half fainting from exhaustion. She begged the federal judge, Josiah Reed, for help. He saw Thomas's name. He saw Samuel's picture. He read the documents, and he stood up with fire in his old eyes. "This is federal conspiracy," he said. "Marshal, saddle up, and bring the girl." They rode hard. Back in Purgatory Springs, Thomas had been dragged into the saloon for a fake trial. Finch poured whiskey for the cheering crowd as Hayes banged a gavel. "Guilty," Hayes declared. "Hang him at once." Two deputies hauled Thomas toward the gallows beam outside the saloon. "Stop!" The saloon doors burst open. Judge Reed stormed in. Behind him stood the U.S. Marshal. And behind them, covered in dust, her hand still on her gun, stood Clara. "This hearing is illegal," the judge roared. "Sheriff Hayes, surrender your badge!" Hayes froze. Finch's lips curled. "He reached for his gun," Clara gasped. Thomas moved. He grabbed a hot branding iron from the fire. The heat didn't scare his scarred hand. It barely even hurt him. He lunged between Finch and Clara. The gunshot cracked. The bullet missed. Thomas slammed the glowing iron into Finch's gun hand. Finch screamed as flesh burned. He dropped the weapon, collapsing to the floor. Hayes surrendered instantly. It was over. Clara ran to Thomas and fell to her knees. His face was pale. He was shaking, weak, bleeding, but alive. She held his face in her hands. "No more running," she whispered. His good eyes softened, full of something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The seasons passed. The ranch healed with them. Finch and Hayes were shipped to Denver for trial. Thomas moved into the house. The bed that once held ghosts now held warmth. Clara stayed by his side. Together they worked the land, cared for the animals, and helped women fleeing cruel contracts. Ruthie stayed too, running the kitchen like a general. People whispered the ranch was a safe place, where no man owned a woman, and no woman had to fear the night. One evening, Clara stood outside under the stars. Thomas stepped beside her. "It is not empty," he rasped, looking at the wide prairie. "It is waiting." She took his hand and guided it gently to her belly. His breath broke. His hand trembled. "You ready?" she whispered. "For one more reason to live?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she was the whole world. For the first time, the prairie wind carried something other than dust. It carried hope.